Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling something, well, pretty intense. We're unpacking a really stark prediction that the United States is on a path to a second civil war. All right, let's just jump right in with the big question, right? Is America on the brink of another civil war? It's a question you're hearing more and more. And the source for our explainer today, Professor Jiang Xueqin, well, he has a very clear and, frankly, pretty chilling answer. And there is. A conflict is very likely. That's the conclusion from Professor Jiang Xueqin. He's not just saying it's possible, he's arguing it's probable. So what we're going to do now is break down his analysis, step by step, to see exactly how he gets there. Okay, so to really get a handle on this prediction, Professor Jiang says you can't start with today. You've got to go back, way back. He makes the case that America's entire identity is, in a way, built on a history of violence. And where does he start? With this number, 434 million. That's how many privately owned guns there are in the US. I mean, think about that. That is literally 1.3 guns for every single person in the country. He calls it a gun-obsessed society. But his argument goes a lot deeper than just that. He claims that if you look at American history, the country's been in a state of almost constant war right from the very beginning. And that conflict isn't seen as this terrible last resort. It's often framed as something noble, almost sacred, a way to fix things. And Professor Jiang lays out this pattern, right? You start with the Revolution, which interestingly he calls the first American Civil War. Then you move into the whole era of Manifest Destiny, which was this incredibly violent westward expansion. And of course, that leads to the Civil War we all know about, the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. His point is, making war is basically baked into the country's DNA. So that's the history. But here's the kicker. Why does Professor Jiang believe things today are even more dangerous than they were back in the 1860s? Well, he points to divisions that he sees as fundamentally, completely unsolvable. And this is where he really gets into the core culture war. He basically frames it as a clash between two totally different ideas of what America should even be. On one side, you have the vision of a Christian nation, going back to the Pilgrims' idea of a kingdom of God. On the other side, a secular empire, rooted in the Enlightenment ideas of the Founding Fathers. And he argues this isn't new. This split has been there from day one. And then you've got another layer on top of that culture war. It's this deep split over America's role as a global empire. Professor Jiang's point is that for a huge chunk of the population, especially on the right, they look at the wars in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and they see only costs. They see their people fighting, their money being spent, and they get nothing back. And that creates this deep, deep resentment and a real desire to just pull back from the world. So you've got these deep, unsolvable divisions. But according to Professor Jiang, what makes them truly explosive, like a powder keg waiting for a match, are three critical breakdowns that he says are just eating away at the fabric of American society. So let's get into these three breakdowns. It's this combination, this perfect storm of over-militarization, a total collapse of the stories that used to unite everyone, and a complete loss of trust in, well, pretty much everything. And that creates a situation where, and this is a direct quote from his analysis, anyone can choose to start a war. First up, over-militarization. And we are not just talking about those civilian guns. Get this. 4 of the top 5 most powerful air forces on the entire planet belong to different branches of the U.S. military. The Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the Marines. That's just wild. And that's before you even count militarized police, federal agencies, and tens of thousands of elite special forces operators. All right, breakdown number 2 is what he calls the breakdown of narratives. These are the shared stories, the beliefs that kind of held everything together. And he says they're just gone. The American dream? Dead. The idea that America is a force for good in the world? Dead. He says even the core liberal value of debate and compromise has been totally replaced by just raw political hatred. And that brings us to the third and final breakdown, authority. Professor Jiang's argument here is that there are no trusted institutions left. The government? People think it's corrupt. The media? Liars. Science? Politicized. He claims the popular belief is that they are all broken, leaving no credible authority to bring people together. So, you've got the powder keg. The tension, the division, the mistrust. What's the spark? What does Professor Jiang think is going to be the thing that finally lights the fuse? And according to Professor Jiang's analysis, that spark has a name: Donald Trump. His argument isn't really about Trump the politician, it's about Trump the symbol. He is, in this view, the literal walking embodiment of the culture war. Everything one side despises and the other champions. So Professor Jiang then introduces this idea he calls Trump derangement syndrome. Now, the way he explains it is that an intense opposition to Trump from institutional leaders causes them to act in ways that undermine their own credibility. This, he claims, erodes public trust even further and, ironically, just ends up making Trump stronger. Okay, let's put all the pieces together. Where does this all lead? What does Professor Jiang predict is the actual future for America? And I gotta warn you, this is the most shocking part of his whole analysis. So the prediction is that this second civil war won't look like the first one. Don't picture two neat armies on a battlefield. No, he says it will be a messy, chaotic, decentralized conflict that plays out over many years through riots, local conflicts, secessions, and even coup attempts. And when the dust settles from all that chaos, what's left? What emerges from the ashes? According to Professor Jiang, the most likely outcome is this: a Christian isolationist theocracy. So you have to ask, why that specific outcome? Why would that faction win? Well, Professor Jiang's logic is pretty straightforward. He argues that the faction aiming to build a white Christian nation is simply the most motivated, the most willing to fight for their vision, and is already heavily represented inside the military and law enforcement. So look, here's the bottom line. Professor Jiang has laid out this really stark prediction. And whether you agree with him or not, he's built a case, right? He's connected historical trends with current divisions to reach this, well, terrifying conclusion. And that leaves all of us with a profound question to think about.